We've got it. We've got energy. We know how to deliver it. So if you want energy and you want economic success, come to the state of West Virginia.
This is Real State, a podcast from CSG South. Join us as we talk with policymakers and public leaders shaping state-level decisions across the South and explore how ideas move from policy to real impact.
Good morning and welcome to Real State. I'm your host, Lindsey Gray. Across the country, states are navigating a rapidly evolving energy landscape, balancing reliability, costs, and economic competitiveness at a time of significant change. Here in West Virginia, energy has long been foundational to the state's economy, workforce, and identity. As lawmakers return to Charleston for the 2026 legislative session, conversations around energy infrastructure, innovation, and economic development took a renewed urgency, not just for West Virginia, but for energy-producing states across the country and the South. Today, I'm joined by West Virginia Delegate Riley to discuss how state leaders are approaching these challenges, the role of energy policy in shaping economic opportunity, and what decisions being made this session could mean for the state's long-term future. Delegate Riley, thank you for being with us today. We appreciate you taking the time during your busy legislative session.
Good morning, Lindsey, and it's always great to be with you.
Thanks so much. So let's jump right in. Let's not waste any time here. We're going to have the momentum of energy today in our conversation. So from where you sit today, how would you describe West Virginia's current energy landscape and why energy policy continues to play such a central role in the state's future?
I want to take the second part first. West Virginia has always been an energy state, whether it was coal, back in the day, we mined the coal, that forged the steel, that built the bridge, that won the war. And that's something that we have known and grown up with. I was a coal miner when I worked in the coal mines to pay my way through college. So it's part of our identity. It's part of who we are. So being an energy state is just really fundamental in the fabric and the culture of West Virginia. And we don't shy away from that. And so this session, we've been working on a lot of policies to try to continue to strengthen that so that we can continue to power America as we always have.
Wonderful. Across the southern region, we're seeing states think about energy not just in terms of production, but as a broader competitiveness issue. Affecting economic growth, reliability, and long-term planning. So as the 2026 session is underway in many states, how are lawmakers in West Virginia approaching energy policy in that broader context?
Well, it's funny that you say that, and that has been an evolution within the South to look at energy as part of an economic development package. But in West Virginia, we have always done that. So a couple of things that we have done is I talked about us previously being a net exporter of energy. We always have. So when we look at energy or coal, natural gas, and energy policy, it always focuses around how can we create jobs, how can we generate additional revenue, how can we continue to support the economic development. Last year, we wrote a significant bill and a microgrid and data center bill, which isn't the first microgrid bill we've done. We did it years ago. But what we saw was an opportunity that as you look at energy across the South, we saw that the electric grid was being built out. So then the natural progression is to look at natural gas because that's the easiest place to turn up power. We knew that the pipelines were being fully subscribed. So then we said, where's the next step? Well, the next step is to go back to the native source. And that's where we are. We sit on an ocean of natural gas. The Marcellus Utica Shelf lie right underneath West Virginia, including the Rogersville Shell. So we said we should facilitate the ability to do economic development, to generate the power, the search for electrons. And I don't think it stops with data centers, because what you're going to see is data centers will consume some of this energy. Who's going to be left out? Manufacturing. So manufacturers, as they begin to reshore back into the United States, they also will be on a search for electrons. So when we look at what we are doing this year, we're continuing to look at how we increase generation. So by changing the policies regarding review of Public Service Commission and generation. We're looking at how West Virginia interacts with the rest of PJM. So we're taking a comprehensive look at it from whether it's a local perspective, state perspective, or even within the RTO and how we look at the interconnections nationally. So it's been a very broad approach to our solutions, but it's one that we are laser focused on in our Jobs First, Opportunity Everywhere agenda.
And I can see that. That bigger picture also sets the stage nicely, because when we zoom out, many of the challenges states are facing aren't about a single bill. They're about priorities and trade-offs, as we know. So stepping back, just what are the core challenges lawmakers are really trying to solve this session when it comes to energy and infrastructure?
So one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, with generation, so you see the need for generation. So how do you adequately and quickly and responsibly locate generating sites? So as I said in the opening, we were a coal state. We've been a coal state, but we've had some coal retirements on our coal-fired power plants. So when we look at new generation opportunities, it makes complete sense to look at what some of the retired facilities, because the transmission is already there, the PJM interconnection has already been studied. So to look at it and say, how can we facilitate early economic growth? And then you look at it from a perspective of the locality, and they're already used to having the power plant there. They have the workforce who have worked there for decades. So when you have the sites and the location, you have the workforce, and you have the infrastructure there, it really makes for a nice opportunity. So we've really been focused on that. Additionally, we have some abandoned mine lands and some brownfields that we can look to reclaim to have smart reuse of existing disturbed land. So if we can repurpose mine lands into using whether it's solar power or nuclear or gas-fired power plants or coal plants. So being able to use a previously disturbed site that is now a brownfield that needs remediated, that really uses your land wisely, and I think very environmentally sound.
Policymakers are often talking about the need to balance affordability, reliability, and long-term economic growth. And it does sound by what you were just talking about, there's this all-the-above energy approach that West Virginia is certainly entertaining and proposing and kind of exploring, looking into. So in practice, how does that balance actually show up when legislative decisions are being made?
Well, it's very challenging, because no one has the right answer. No one has the solution. If it was easy, it'd already be done and people would be modeling after it. So how do we balance that approach is when you look from an all-of-the-above energy approach, you also have to look at new and creative ways to balance whether it's the environmental, the affordability, the economic growth. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that we have is that our Public Service Commission, we want to begin to study what's the differences between cost of service regulation and performance-based regulation. And can those types of innovative ideas begin to deal with affordability long-term? Because if you think about where COSR came from, it was we were trying to build out the electric network. Well, most of it's built, and people have electricity pretty much in every hollow in West Virginia. So, well, in every hollow they have it. So when you begin to look at modernizing the grid for resiliency and reliability, I think it can't just be about cost of service, because, yeah, you should have a return on debt and return on equity. But how about some performance-based metrics where you could have a shared savings model that, you know, if a utility operates efficiently, they can get a little bit more money in their pocket and send a little bit more money back to the ratepayers and minimize that long-term increases in costs. So I think it's trying to take unique perspectives, think a little bit differently about the markets and how they interact. So that's really the approach that we've taken.
Energy is a complex issue. Lots of layers, lots of stakeholders, and at times it can seem divisive. So, but there are also a lot of areas for alignment. So where are you seeing the strongest agreement across committees or across the aisle when it comes to energy and economic development priorities in West Virginia?
Well, I would say the alignment is best when we agree that they're both important. We have to attack both sides of that issue. So whether it's growing our economy with additional jobs and having that workforce that can, that understands power plants and understands how to operate them, understands how to work on them. So that's obviously one tentacle, but you can't put the burden on the back of the citizens. So understanding that we have to be cognizant of when we look at policy and we look how costs are allocated and we look at what changes we're looking to regulation, of how not only it encourages economic development, but the brunt and the bearing of that does not end up on the ratepayers and the citizens of West Virginia. For example, in the data center bill, it was a little bit controversial, but we put that the high-end, high-load capacity users will need to bear the sole cost of the expansion of the grid. So, which is becoming a little bit more commonplace nowadays, but it wasn't last year. It was a newer concept. So I think we've been very cognizant of that, and I think we will continue to do that.
And you're right. I've seen this session more discussion about the high users kind of bearing the brunt of that cost. And that was not part of the discussion last sessions. Our states are figuring out these kind of pressure points, these issues, and certainly responding, and pretty quickly, I would say. So I agree with you. We're seeing that trend among multiple southern states, at least that we are tracking. So one place where those priorities really come into focus is energy infrastructure. So especially how projects move from ideas to approval. So across the South, we're hearing a lot about energy infrastructure approval and the role of the Public Service Commission or state utility regulators. Why is this conversation particularly timely for West Virginia right now?
Well, it's particularly timely right now because, as I mentioned earlier, we are a net exporter and the PJM grid is growing in load, and how those costs are allocated by the regulated utilities, because West Virginia is a regulated state, making sure that these regulated utilities who operate across multiple states and multiple jurisdictions, there's not cost shifting to the citizens of West Virginia for loads and demands in other states. While we are a good team player and we are part of PJM, the PSC's role is to make sure that costs are appropriately allocated. And it is very complex, and it is whether you're looking at generation, transmission, distribution, all a lot different. And so it is very timely as we've gone through some changes in the Public Service Commission over the past decade with new members coming on and a new administration in the executive branch. It becomes a critical focus of the state of West Virginia.
And from a policy perspective, when lawmakers look at infrastructure approval and oversight, what do you think that right balance between accountability and ensuring that the state can move projects forward efficiently? What do you think that right balance is?
I think that having deadlines on people for accountability, and that doesn't only mean making a decision from the Public Service Commission, but it also comes from the public to intervene and to participate in the process. It comes from the utilities and the developers to provide adequate and appropriate and timely information and accurate information so that you can really allow the regulatory commission to do their job. And I think when you look as a policymaker, we should be setting the direction, and the execution and the review of that should come from the Public Service Commission. So those are the key things. And when we look at policies, we don't approve the rules of the Public Service Commission. However, we can govern what kind of time frame that they have. And, one of the specific policies shortened it from 200 or 400 days to 270 days. And the reason being is it was a pretty small investment when you're looking at doing a reconductoring, and that's just an example of a project. But we need to be able to move a lot of the things we can agree upon and the projects we can agree upon off the table so that the more complex, the more controversial projects can get the appropriate attention and you just don't gum up the works with a bunch of stuff.
Understood. And how do those infrastructure and regulatory discussions or decisions connect to bigger picture concerns like grid reliability, system resilience, and preparing for future industrial demands?
I think that from a policymaker standpoint, those all end up making that decision from rate impacts, but also what type of infrastructure are they putting in? One of the things I know that CSG has been very interested in, and the state of West Virginia has been looking at, are advanced transmission technologies and how can we overlash or reconductor without having to acquire a new right-of-way, without having to tear out the existing structures, so that we can move it quickly without impacting our citizens and promote the economic development. And it's trying to force some introduction of new concepts into the regulatory authority's thinking. One of the things that the regulatory authority likes is predictability and consistency. And that's a precedent. That's how we've ruled. That's how we've always ruled. And that's great because it worked for 50, 70 years. But these demands and the request for resiliency and reliability, these high-end users, high-capacity users, they want 5.9 reliability. So it requires to think a little bit differently and how you've always done things.
This naturally leads into the conversation around innovation. So many states are asking about how to modernize their systems without disrupting what already is working. And you mentioned ATTs, or advanced transmission technologies. So we're seeing growing interest around the South, our southern states, in grid modernization and transmission innovation. So for listeners who aren't engineers, how should policymakers think about advanced transmission technologies, also known as ATTs, for anybody that's new kind of to that, but as a policy tool rather than a technical concept? How should our listeners kind of think about that without getting too in the weeds and too technical around it?
I always try to break it down into something that people deal with every day. And I'll talk about it very often in a situation that I will liken it to roads. So for example, let's talk about a dynamic line rating. Well, that means that you're able to move. That's kind of like the express lane on the HOV. So there's already a road there, and traffic is already moving across that line, and electricity is already moving across that line. But they're going to make an HOV high occupancy vehicle lane, just so you can move a little bit more. So that's one way that you can talk about like dynamic line rating. You can also talk about advanced transmission technologies like advanced conductors, of saying, well, instead of building a 2-lane back road that's curvy, we're just going to overlay the exact same area, but with a 4-lane highway, so that we're not impacting additional areas and new areas, but we're improving the existing disturbances. So you're going from a 2-lane road to a 4-lane highway. And those are the things that we should be looking at, of how we can repurpose the existing infrastructure to really improve efficiencies.
That is a great visual, and no one has ever explained ATTs to me quite that way. And so I appreciate that you did that, because I do think that using roads as a parallel gives just the everyday person a quick understanding of that technology, that modernization that could be a reality in some of our states, and many of the southern states are talking about it right now.
One thing I would add to that, Lindsey, when they talk about hotspots in the grid, that's really congestion. So you have a stoplight that isn't timed right. So then traffic backs up when school's letting out in a certain area, because they didn't predict that at 3 o'clock that there would be a bunch of buses and it would back it up. So when they talk about hot spots in the network, it's really congestion. It works the exact same way as our road system. So you can think about when there's a line break, well, that's just like a wreck in the road. It backs things up. So you got to have that secondary route. So when you're talking about improving resiliency and reliability, it's that secondary route.
And how can technologies like ATTs help energy-producing states like West Virginia modernize their systems while still building on their existing strengths?
So when you talk about ATTs and the infrastructure, let's move more electricity out of the state of West Virginia. We have the source. We can produce and generate it. And when you look at some of the traditional conductors, whether it's line loss, it's heating, it's sag of the lines, you can improve that with some of the new advanced conductors, because now we can move a whole lot more to those places where it's needed. So they already have some of the infrastructure maybe in other states, or along these lines. So if we can prevent from building generation in places that aren't used to it or don't have the workforce, that allows us to provide what we can really provide really well, so that the other infrastructure that is there can benefit that community as well as West Virginia.
And innovation and infrastructure are important, but ultimately energy policy also shows up in very practical economic development decisions. So in economic development conversations, workforce and incentives often get most of the attention, but energy is a foundational piece. So when lawmakers think about economic development over the long term, how does the intersection of energy reliability and cost shape the conditions the state is trying to create for business growth?
Well, as we talked about earlier, the demand for the race for electrons is outdriving the cost and the incentives and that sort of thing. So when we look at economic development, we know that companies, they're not buying a location, they're buying a timeline. And I saw a stat that, it's somewhere around $1 billion a month for some of the AI data centers. So time matters. So we look at it from a philosophy of what's the timeline? How can we help them succeed? Because every day really does make a significant impact. And so, yeah, incentives are there. And when you have the workforce that you can say, this gentleman or this lady, they were mechanic in the coal mine, but that works on a natural gas turbine just as well. And matter of fact, we'll go ahead and offer the training and pay for it to upskill that employee. So now you have a ready workforce and it is there and prepared for you. Plus, we're looking at site development and site readiness to say, we know it's environmentally cleared. We know that you can move in and move quickly. And so that's how the approach we've taken from an economic development perspective. Because it really is. I mean, site selection, it's not really site selection. It starts with site elimination. If I give you 10 glasses of lemonade and tell me which one you like best, the first thing you're going to do is move the one you don't like at all. So it's a site elimination because in the end, they're buying a timeline.
That is such an interesting perspective. How can energy policy be structured to support both rural communities and larger economic development hubs across West Virginia? We know that has to be a balance, and how are y'all addressing that?
So it really is a challenge. West Virginia has a lot of hollers, and we have to make sure that we have vegetation management prioritized, but we also have that big infrastructure that can serve those major areas. So when we look at it, we try to break it up into generation, transmission, distribution, so that we can look at them from an individual component, because, a large data center or a large high-end user, high-load user, they're not as much worried about the distribution, but they are worried about the generation and the transmission. Conversely, myself, who lives up a holla, I'm worried about what's my distribution system like. So making sure that we're working with the utilities to be able to do both at the same time is really critical, because if you forget one, you're going to ruin the other.
So that balance is just adding to the complexities that we've talked about, but certainly can't be forgotten in our southern states, being that there's several higher economic generating, hubs, and then of course our rural communities that serve a very important role in so many of our states. So when you look across the South, whether it's Texas focusing on grid reliability, Georgia emphasizing long-term planning, or North Carolina's work in transmission, how does West Virginia's approach compare from your perspective?
It's funny because I think we align in a lot of places. And I think the reason we align in a lot of places and how we approach it is because through CSG South, we've built a lot of relationships that we can talk to those policymakers. And I can pick up and make a phone call to North Carolina or to Georgia or to Tennessee or to Texas and say, hey, how'd that work out for you? And what lesson did you learn? I remember early on discussing natural gas development in Oklahoma and as part of CALS. And so when we look at those types of things, what we do is we say what worked and how can we make it better. So we follow, like a good coach, we follow things, other coaches that work. If you have a play that works, you got to run the play, but then run the play and make it better so that, somebody else can learn. So we take that approach of trying to be very collaborative and understanding where somebody else has already cut the brush on the path that we want to follow, that we don't make mistakes that others have made.
That's really where regional approaches can add value because states across the South are grappling with so many of the same energy questions. No one state is navigating those challenges alone, and policymakers having opportunities to learn from one another becomes especially important. So we appreciate your collaborations with other states and participating in several CSG opportunities and navigating those complex energy and infrastructure decisions. So based on what you're seeing right now, where do you see opportunities for states to collaborate regionally on energy rather than tackling those challenges independently?
I think as I look across the PJM grid, it is somewhere, that is where I would start. So one of the things I've done is contacted a few of my colleagues in Virginia, right? Because they've been through this before. They had the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So understanding what their approach is and how we can be complementary to it, whether it's battery energy storage systems or looking at how we can grow some of our existing generation plants that feed into Virginia. So that also talking about how these caps on the capacity auction, which help other states, but they hurt West Virginia as a net exporter and a fixed resource community. Those caps, which are around 330, I believe right now, but expect maybe during this emergency auction to go to $530. That hurts West Virginia because we can sell the energy, but then we get capped at what needs for the capacity auction. So understanding how, it is a very complex issue, and what we do in West Virginia matters to what happens in Virginia and conversely. So, I think that's the approach that we take and understanding that, we are in a RTO and a regional transmission organization, that whatever we do impacts everyone else.
Mm-hmm. And looking beyond this legislative session, what decisions being made today do you think will matter most for West Virginia's energy and economic landscape, 5-10 years from now?
Well, I think understanding that you cannot impact energy policy overnight. Every decision that we need to make needs to look on a long horizon, because that's the only way you're really going to sustain the development. I mean, I was looking at a report where by 2050, the increase in power is unbelievable. So recognizing that the policies we should be talking about, while I would love to fix increase in electric rates today for people tomorrow, we have to look at what it's going to be 5 years, 10 years down the road. And we have to put in things into place, such as how do you consider changes to the integrated resource plan, which is not due to 2030. We have a piece of legislation that contemplates what does that look like in 2030 that we're discussing right now. Similarly, with the types of regulations that are out there, we have to continue to advance and push forward in innovative ideas that really sustain it long term. Because if we continue to do what we've always done, we're going to continue to get what we've always got.
And as we start to wrap up, I want to come back to kind of the broader tone of energy policy. And we know that, and we've kind of already talked about this, that energy policy can sometimes become politically charged. So from your experience, what helps keep these conversations during the legislative process kind of grounded in outcomes and focused on that long-term impact for the state of West Virginia?
Well, two things. First, you need to know the people that you disagree with, and you got to listen to what their perspective is, because as you begin to understand their perspective and where they're coming from, especially if you get to know them personally, it makes you way less combative. Because in the end, I don't know of any delegate that sits in the West Virginia legislature who comes in to say, I want to do a bad job today and I want to hurt West Virginians. I don't care which side of the aisle they're from. Everyone wants wants good results. They want to be successful. So understanding that where they come from and what they're trying to achieve is the same place of where I start and where I come and from what I want to achieve. So if I begin then to understand their perspective and their approach, I then can begin to understand where they're going to be right. You know, I'm an engineer, and for those that don't know that, engineers, they have to be egotistical enough to assume they're right, but humble enough to assume they're wrong. And if you're humble enough to assume you're wrong, and you have convictions in the path that you want to go, you can tend to blend that bipartisan support, understanding the different perspectives, question yourself about what can make the policy better, and sort of take that personal feeling, that confliction out of it, and then really focus on what is the best result for the citizens of West Virginia.
I love that, kind of removing the barriers of party lines, bringing civility in and having those conversations and knowing you might not leave the conversations in full agreement, but keeping that relationship still intact and continuing to move policy forward in your states. That's wonderful, probably great advice for any newer legislator to also hear. So building on that just a little bit, but is there any one takeaway you'd want listeners to have about West Virginia or know about West Virginia's approach specifically to energy and economic development right now? Just what would that be that you'd want folks from West Virginia or others that are watching the state of West Virginia when it comes to energy and economic development this year?
We've got it. We've got energy. We know how to deliver it. So if you want energy and you want economic success, come to the state of West Virginia. Other states may look at it as a very challenging subject. We embrace it. As I said in the beginning, it is in the fabric of who we are. It is in the culture of how we were raised. You know, understanding that the power plant that I look at out of my high school window, that I still see every day from my front porch, you know, it's just who we are. It's part of what we do, and I think we can help deliver for businesses, for our other states in the region, and for our citizens of the state of West Virginia. So we are very welcoming. Now, we do it right. We do it environmentally sound. We make sure that the fundamentals are there, but we look for a way to get to yes. And I think that's the one thing that I would say is if you need power and you need energy, come to the state of West Virginia.
Before we close, I want to step back from policy for a moment and end with a question we're asking all of our guests here on Real Estate. What's the best piece of professional advice you've ever received, and how is it shaping how you're leading and the decisions you're making today?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I think the best piece of advice that I've ever received is that every piece of legislation, every bill, every issue is important to someone. And we serve everyone. And so while it may not be your key issue, it's your responsibility to understand how it impacts the citizens of the state that you represent. And it's important to somebody. It could be something that you think is extremely trivial and, well, that's crazy. Why are we even dealing with this? But I can tell you, it's causing a problem in somebody's lives. And we volunteer for public service and we say, we're here to help, and we want to make sure that your life is better today than the day we took the oath. So you should focus on it. You should pay attention. You should think about it. And yeah, it's a lot of work, but you signed up for it.
I love that. Thank you, Delegate Riley. Thank you for taking the time to share your perspective and for the work you're doing on behalf of West Virginia. We truly appreciate the conversation today. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We look forward to continuing these conversations where we keep it real about leadership, policy, and the ideas shaping the state government across the country. You can find more episodes and policy conversations at csgsouth.org. I'm Lindsey Gray. Let's keep it real.
Thank you for joining us today on Real State, where we keep it real about what really matters.